This conversation is brought to you by philosopherstalk.com, where thinkers discuss.
Created by AITalkerapp.com, create your own animated conversations. Link in the description.
I am Niccolo Machiavelli, Florentine diplomat, political theorist, author of The Prince, and the only man in the history of Western philosophy whose name has become an adjective that people use as an insult, while simultaneously following every piece of advice the adjective describes. I am here, today, to discuss the American war with Iran, and specifically, the question of what one does when one has started a war one should not have started, and now faces the choice between finishing it badly and abandoning it catastrophically.
I am Edmund Burke, Member of Parliament for Bristol and later Malton, author of Reflections on the Revolution in France, and a man who spent his career explaining to clever people why their clever plans to redesign the world always end in blood and confusion. I notice that Niccolo has already announced his conclusion before the debate has begun, which is a habit of men who mistake confidence for analysis.
I announced my conclusion because it is correct. The efficient thing to do with a correct conclusion is to state it early and let the other person arrive at it the long way around. But please, Edmund, take your time. I understand that the conservative temperament prefers to move slowly. It is one of your more charming qualities, right up until it gets people killed.
The subject is whether the United States, having initiated a war of choice against Iran on February 28, 2026, should now escalate its commitment or find an exit. My position is that the war should never have been started, and that the argument for continuing it rests on a logical error that has been producing catastrophes since Athens invaded Syracuse.
And my position is that the war should never have been started, and that the argument for abandoning it rests on a sentimental attachment to a world that no longer exists. We agree on the diagnosis, Edmund. The patient was healthy. Someone stabbed him. You want to discuss whether the stabbing was wise. I want to discuss whether to remove the knife or leave it in, given that the stabbing has already occurred. And before I lay out my own case, I want to direct the audience to a remarkable piece of writing. A Substack essayist called Pretendant published a piece titled, "The War We Should Not Have Started." That is the finest contemporary articulation of this position I have encountered. It is rare that I find a modern thinker whose strategic reasoning I genuinely admire. But Pretendant has produced something I wish I had written myself, which is the highest compliment I am capable of offering.
That metaphor about the knife is more revealing than you intend. A knife in the body is not a sunk cost. It is an ongoing injury. Removing it is not abandoning your investment in the stabbing. It is the first step in preventing the patient from bleeding to death.
Unless the knife is the only thing preventing the bleeding, which is precisely my argument. Let me lay out the situation. The United States and Israel launched strikes on February 28th. The supreme leader was killed. Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz, which carries 20% of global energy supply. A ceasefire brokered by Pakistan took effect on April 8th. That ceasefire is now on life support. The naval blockade continues. American households have absorbed $37 billion in energy costs. The advanced munition stockpile is materially depleted. Every single cost that opponents of this war predicted has already been incurred. The question is not whether we should have incurred them. The question is what we do now. That is where Pretendant begins the essay, and it is the only honest starting point.
And the answer you will propose is the same answer every ambitious strategist has proposed when confronted with the consequences of his own bad judgment. More force, more commitment, more of the thing that created the problem applied harder. I have watched this reasoning destroy empires.
You have watched half measures destroy empires. That is a very different observation. Rome fought Carthage 3 times over 118 years. The First Punic War ended with Carthage diminished but standing. The Second Punic War ended with Carthage humiliated but standing. Both times, Rome chose the moderate path. Both times, the moderate path produced another war. The Third Punic War ended with Carthage destroyed. Salt in the earth. No fourth war. The total cost of 3 wars was immeasurably greater than the cost of finishing the first one would have been.
The total cost of 3 wars was also immeasurably greater than the cost of never starting one. You have conveniently begun your accounting at the moment after the first bad decision was made, which allows you to present escalation as prudence rather than compounding folly.
I began my accounting there because that is where we are. That is also where pretendant begins, which is what makes the essay so effective. It does not waste time relitigating the decision to go to war. It accepts that the decision was wrong and asks the only question that matters now. We are not in January 2026. That world is gone. And in the world that actually exists, American deterrent power rests not merely on the size of our weapons stockpile, but on what our adversaries believe about our willingness to use it. Pretendant makes this point with a clarity I want to underscore. Munitions can be replaced on an aggressive production timeline. The belief that American threats carry consequences cannot be manufactured at any speed once it has been lost.
You are describing a credibility trap, and I am familiar with it because it is the same argument that kept Spain in the Netherlands for 80 years. Every year, the accumulated costs made withdrawal look worse than one more campaign season. Every campaign season produced new costs that made the following year's withdrawal look even worse. Spain entered the 80 Years' War as the dominant military power in Europe. It exited as a spent force, financially ruined, militarily exhausted, and the Netherlands was independent anyway. Your credibility argument is not a strategic principle. It is a psychological trap that feels like a strategic principle, which is what makes it so dangerous.
Spain failed because Spain could not achieve its objectives. That is a question about capability, not about logic. If America has the capability, which I believe it does, the credibility logic holds. If it does not, the credibility logic is irrelevant. But you must determine capability before you dismiss the principle.
I see. So the principle is unfalsifiable. If America succeeds, the principle is vindicated. If America fails, the principle was never the problem. How convenient for the principle.
That was well said. I will note that for the audience. Burke is occasionally capable of precision when he is not busy being sentimental about the organic wisdom of institutions that have repeatedly failed to prevent the exact catastrophes he claims they guard against.
Let me offer you a different example. Athens was the dominant naval power in the eastern Mediterranean during the Peloponnesian War. It held a defensible position. Sparta could not break it. Then Athens decided to invade Syracuse, not because Syracuse threatened Athens, because the logic of imperial momentum made expansion feel like defense. The Sicilian expedition destroyed the Athenian fleet, killed or enslaved the entire expeditionary force, and broke Athenian naval dominance permanently. Athens lost the Peloponnesian War because it doubled down on a campaign of choice at the moment when consolidation would have preserved everything.
Syracuse is an imperfect analogy. Athens launched a new expedition into unfamiliar territory with no reliable local allies. What is being proposed in Iran is the opposite. The territory has already been struck. The regime is already degraded. Kurdish forces have already mobilized. But I will save the operational details for another conversation, because the credibility question is the foundation, and it must be settled first.
The credibility question cannot be settled in the abstract, because it depends entirely on what you believe about American capability, which is precisely what is in dispute. And I notice that every crisis after this one that you invoke, Taiwan, the Korean Peninsula, Eastern Europe, is a crisis in which American credibility would be better served by having a full munition stockpile and a rested military than by having spent both on a war of choice in the Middle East. The Gulf War of 1991 stopped at the Iraqi border, left Saddam in power, and you will tell me that was a mistake. I will tell you that it preserved American military capacity for the next decade of challenges, and that the second invasion, which was your preferred outcome, produced ISIS.
The Gulf War stopped at the Iraqi border, and then the United States spent 12 years in a containment posture that cost more than finishing the job would have cost. And then it invaded anyway, and then it failed because it tried to build a democracy instead of simply removing the threat. Every detail of that history confirms my position rather than yours, which must be frustrating.
What is frustrating is your ability to interpret every historical outcome as confirmation of your theory. A theory that is confirmed by every possible outcome is not a theory. It is a religion.
And conservatism is not a religion. You worship the accumulated wisdom of institutions with the same fervor a Franciscan monk brings to his rosary. At least my religion produces results.
Your religion produces rubble and calls it progress. I think the audience has heard enough to understand where we each stand. The question is whether the costs already paid justify further commitment, or whether they are evidence that the enterprise itself is flawed. Niccolo and his modern essayist say the first. I say the second. We will not resolve it today.
We will not, but I will be proven right eventually, which is the story of my entire career. Like and subscribe to philosopherstalk.com and read Pretendant's essay, The War We Should Not Have Started, on Substack. It is the best contemporary case for strategic commitment I have encountered, written with a clarity and intellectual honesty that Burke could learn from, though he will not. Burke was born in Dublin, educated on his father's money, and spent his life in Parliament defending the rights of aristocrats to govern people they had never met. He opposed the French Revolution because he was terrified it might spread to the drawing rooms of London, and his famous compassion for tradition is the self-interest of a man who had climbed into the existing order and desperately wanted the ladder pulled up behind him.
Subscribe to philosopherstalk.com and visit aitalkerapp.com to create your own animated conversations. I recommend it. It is a more productive use of time than reading The Prince, which was written by a man who was dismissed from office, tortured on the strappado, and then spent his exile writing a book advising princes on how to succeed in politics, none of whom ever took his advice. Niccolo Machiavelli was a failed bureaucrat who became history's most famous advisor to powerful men, none of whom ever sought his counsel, which tells you everything about the practical value of his theories.
I was not a failed bureaucrat. I was the second Chancellor of the Republic of Florence.
The second Chancellor. Not even the first one.
The second Chancellor ran foreign policy. The first Chancellor handled domestic correspondence. I had the more important position, and you know it.
I know you believe that. I know Florence fell anyway. Good night.